Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight's story isn't about knights or kings or people who spent too long polishing their swords. No, tonight we're going to wander down the darker alleyways of the Middle Ages, the kind of places where you hold your coin pouch a little tighter and maybe walk just a bit faster. We're talking about thieves, bandits, poisoners, smugglers, and all the other folks who made medieval life a little more unpredictable. So, tuck yourself in, let the candlelight flicker in your mind, and let us drift back to a time when organized crime sometimes meant three guys with sticks hiding behind a bush. Now, when we say criminals in medieval times, we're not talking about Netflix-level masterminds. Most of them weren't exactly criminal geniuses. In fact, a lot of them were just hungry, desperate, or very bad at math when it came to calculating risk versus reward. The medieval justice system wasn't exactly forgiving either. You could lose a hand for stealing bread, or get hanged for taking someone's chicken. So, naturally, people still did it anyway. Imagine a dusty English road in the 14th century, the kind that looks romantic in movies but in real life. It's muddy, it smells vaguely of horse, and the nearest town is half a day away. A lone traveler rides through, humming, maybe thinking about ale or love, or both. And out from the trees, surprise, a group of highwaymen. They were the original your money or your life people. Only, in most cases, they took both. Highway robbery was a full-time medieval career, though not a long-lasting one. Some of these bandits worked alone, but many operated in gangs, ambushing merchant wagons or noble carriages. The famous ones even got nicknames. There's a record from 1316 of a man named Eustace Falville, a noble-born outlaw from England, who basically lived his life like a chaotic video game side quest. He robbed, murdered, kidnapped, and somehow still managed to get away with it for years. Mostly because he targeted people everyone else hated too. Medieval England was weirdly forgiving if your crimes were popular. The Falville brothers, yes, there were several of them, were like a medieval family business of banditry. They operated with style, charm, and the occasional moral code. Sort of like the Robin Hoods of Leicester, except with fewer merry men and more stabbing. They even kidnapped a royal justice once and ransomed him back, because apparently that was a reasonable career move back then. But not all criminals had noble blood or fancy armor. Some were just poor, unlucky, or opportunistic. City thieves in places like London or Paris had to be creative, especially because punishment was so severe. In medieval Paris, if you were caught pickpocketing, you might get whipped through the streets, branded, or if you were a repeat offender, simply hanged in front of a crowd that had probably seen it all before. Still, thieves kept stealing, and honestly, it's kind of impressive. You've got to imagine what pickpocketing looked like in a world without pockets. People tied their money bags to their belts, so stealing them meant untying a knot while pretending to be friendly, and hoping the other person didn't notice before you finished your fake laugh. Meanwhile, in Italy, especially in cities like Florence and Venice, crime could get complicated. You had noble families feuding for generations, assassins paid to settle scores, and courtesans who knew too much. One wrong rumor, one poisoned cup of wine, and suddenly someone's uncle was mysteriously ill. And speaking of poison, let's talk about medieval murder's favorite sidekick. Poison was the go-to weapon for people who preferred not to get their hands dirty, which, honestly, fair. The most famous case of this in the later Middle Ages was probably the Borgia family, though technically Renaissance. Not strictly medieval, but the habit started long before them. Apothecaries sold herbs and minerals that could heal or kill, depending on how you mixed them. And since medicine was basically let's see what happens, accidents were very easy to fake. But maybe the most haunting story of all came from France. The tale of Gilles de Rais. He was a nobleman, a soldier, and a companion of Joan of Arc, before he turned into something far darker. By the time his crimes were uncovered in the 1440s, he was accused of kidnapping, murder, and acts so horrifying that even other criminals went, "Okay, that's too much." He's one of those people historians still argue about, part myth, part monster. But his trial became a symbol of just how far medieval evil could go when no one dared question a noble. Even his confession was described in chilling detail, and whether every word was true or exaggerated. The legend of Gilles de Rais still stands as one of history's earliest true crime nightmares. Not all medieval criminals were so extreme, of course. Some were just kind of funny in their bad luck. There's one story from an English town record where a man was arrested for stealing geese. The geese, apparently, did not take it well. They made so much noise that he was caught within minutes. Imagine trying to run away quietly while holding two furious birds under your arms. And then there were false criminals, people accused for reasons that had nothing to do with crime at all. Maybe your neighbor didn't like you. Maybe you owed someone money. Maybe you looked at a priest's donkey the wrong way. Congratulations, you might be going to trial by ordeal, which was exactly what it sounds like. You could be thrown into a river with your hands tied. If you floated, that meant the water rejected you. Guilty. If you sank, well, innocent, but also, drowned. The system had some bugs. The medieval world was harsh, but also weirdly fascinating in how it treated justice. Prisons weren't really punishment. They were just waiting rooms for whatever came next. Real punishments were public: hanging, branding, stocks, mutilation, anything to make sure everyone else thought twice before doing the same thing. It was more about the show than the fairness. Even execution days were community events. People would bring their kids, snacks, and gossip. It was entertainment, in a grim way, the medieval version of you on T, believe what happens next. But here's the strange thing. Despite all the horror, the cruelty, the dirt, and the superstition, crime still existed in every corner, because behind all the religious fear and royal laws, people were still people, tempted, desperate, and sometimes just foolish. They stole bread, cheated taxes, lied in court, or plotted revenge, because life in the Middle Ages was hard. And morality sometimes came second to survival. And as night settles in, it's kind of eerie to think some of these names, these forgotten bandits and killers, are still written in dusty records, sitting in old archives. Their stories, in a way, survived longer than their victims. Their ghosts, made of ink and parchment. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine the quiet streets of a medieval town, the flicker of torchlight, the sound of boots on cobblestone, the faint rattle of a guard's armor, somewhere in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, someone hiding in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to make their move. Sleep tight though, we're just getting started. The sound of footsteps fades, and the town square grows quiet again. Just the soft creak of wooden signs in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks, because dogs always bark at night, even in the 14th century, and in the cold corners of the medieval world, where justice slept with one eye open, someone else was always awake. See, the thing about medieval criminals is that they weren't just thieves or killers, they were also survivors, because back then, the line between criminal and poor guy trying to eat was thinner than a monk's patience during Lent. You could become an outlaw for something as small as refusing to pay an unfair tax or stealing bread when you were starving. Once you were declared outside the law, that was it. No protection, no rights. Anyone could rob you, hurt you, or kill you without consequence. The forests and moors of England, France, and Germany became the unofficial headquarters for these outlaws. Deep in those woods, campfires flickered tiny pockets of rebellion against a world that offered very little mercy. They were rough, dirty, and constantly on edge. But for some, it was still better than the alternative, prison. Now, if you think modern prisons are bad, medieval prisons would have been your personal nightmare. Picture this: a damp, windowless room, the smell of mold and sweat, straw on the floor that hasn't been changed in ever. Rats were basically your roommates, and the bathroom was whatever corner you could crawl to. You weren't sent there to be punished, you were sent there to wait. For a fine, for a bribe, or for execution. They'd often charge prisoners for food, blankets, or even the removal of chains. So if you couldn't pay, well, you just didn't eat. Many died long before they even got to their trial. And speaking of trials, medieval justice was a fascinating mix of religion, superstition, and complete guesswork. Let's say you're accused of theft. You swear you didn't do it. The judge, who's probably also a landowner, a church official, and someone's cousin, might decide to test your honesty through something called trial by ordeal. Sounds fun, right? You could be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar in your bare hand for several paces. Then your hand would be bandaged and rechecked 3 days later. If it looked clean, God had protected you, innocent. If it was infected, guilty. And of course, in a world without antibiotics or soap, guess how that usually went? Other times, they'd just toss you into water, tied up to see if you desink or float. It's the medieval version of let's ask gravity what it thinks. Honestly, you had better odds playing dice with the devil. But here's where it gets even stranger. Some of these systems created folk heroes. The most famous, of course, is Robin Hood, the outlaw of Sherwood Forest. Now, historians still argue about whether Robin was real, a blend of multiple real bandits, or just a story that people needed to believe in. But either way, his legend became something special. Imagine living in a time when the poor were crushed under taxes, when nobles could kill a peasant and call it a minor inconvenience. Then suddenly, stories spread of a man in the forest who stole from the rich and gave to the poor, who outsmarted corrupt sheriffs and vanished like mist. Even if he wasn't real, he was something better, hope in human form. The idea that maybe justice could exist somewhere, even if it had to wear a hood and carry a bow. Of course, most outlaws weren't nearly that poetic. Many were just robbers who figured out how to run fast. But still, every tavern, every village fire had its own local version of a Robin Hood, and sometimes those stories blurred the line between myth and memory. Women, too, found their own criminal corners in this rough world. The Middle Ages weren't exactly fair to women. Most had very few rights, and even fewer ways to survive without a husband or family. So some turned to theft, smuggling, or even piracy. Yes, female pirates existed, and they were just as ruthless as the men, maybe more, because they had to prove themselves every time they stepped on deck. One of the most notorious was Jeanne de Clisson, a French noblewoman in the 1300s. When her husband was executed by the French king, she didn't mourn quietly. She sold everything she owned, bought a fleet of ships, and turned pirate, targeting only French vessels, painting her ships black, and beheading every noble she caught. They called her the Lioness of Brittany. It's not exactly the kind of bedtime story the church would approve of, but you have to admit, that's dedication. Not all women used swords, though. Some used secrets. Poisoners, spies, and con artists. Many found ways to play the system from inside. The church called them sinners. Society called them dangerous. But history, quietly, calls them survivors. And in a world where confession could be beaten out of you, and where trials were basically theatre, a lot of criminals weren't really criminals at all. Take the case of Marjorie Germain, known in 15th century England as the Witch of Eye. She was a healer, known for making potions and charms, mostly harmless stuff, fertility remedies, love charms, herbal cures. But when politics and paranoia collided, she became a convenient scapegoat. She was accused of witchcraft, tortured, and burned at the stake. Her only real crime was being a woman who knew things she wasn't supposed to know. That's the heartbreaking thread running through so many medieval criminal stories. Most of them didn't teach who's evil, they just fell into it, or were pushed. Sometimes it was hunger, sometimes it was vengeance, and sometimes it was just being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong face. But the real monsters, the ones who chose evil, left marks that never faded. In 15th century Germany, there was Peter Niers, a name whispered by travelers for generations. He was said to be a murderer, a cannibal, and a sorcerer, one of the most feared men in Europe. Legend says he carried with him the hearts of his victims, believing they gave him magical powers. When he was finally caught, the stories said his execution lasted 3 whole days. Whether every detail was true or not, it didn't matter. The legend became a warning. Evil, when left unchecked, eventually eats itself. And for every Peter Niers, there were hundreds of petty criminals, pickpockets, counterfeiters, smugglers, and cheats. In markets and fairs, the air was full of laughter, song, and the occasional whispered deal. Someone always sold something fake: watered wine, short waits, spoiled meat, disguised with spices. Crime was everywhere, not as darkness, but as part of daily life. It wasn't just survival. It was a kind of grim comedy, a dance between desperation and opportunity. Even religion couldn't escape it. Monks stole relics, priests took bribes, bishops sold forgiveness like a marketplace good. There's a record of one monk in the 12th century who faked visions of saints just to get free meals and attention. You'd think heaven would be harder to scam, but apparently not. So next time someone says the Middle Ages were about faith and honor, remember, they were also about stolen geese, poisoned goblets, and pirates in black ships hunting nobles at sea. It's all part of the same world, a world where law and sin slept in the same bed, and sometimes couldn't tell which one was snoring. The candle burns low, shadows stretch along stone walls, and somewhere, in a dungeon cell, a man hums quietly to himself, waiting for dawn, or a pardon, or a miracle. Outside, a guard yawns, the stars keep watch, and the medieval night carries on, cold, restless, and alive with the stories of the forgotten and the condemned. The night deepens. Somewhere in a castle hall, a candle gutters out, and the last glow fades into darkness. In that silence, you can almost hear the slow breath of an age that believed pain could tell the truth. Because in the medieval mind, confession was everything, and torture was just the shortcut to get there. It's a strange, grim logic. They believed that if you were innocent, God would give you strength to endure, and if you died before the end of it, well, that was between you and heaven. Every city, every kingdom, had its own preferred methods. In France, they liked the strappado, a rope tied behind your back, lifting you off the ground until your shoulders dislocated. In England, they used the rack, a wooden frame with rollers at each end, slowly stretching the body until bones popped like old wood in the fire. And then there was the iron boot, the thumbscrew, the wheel, devices that were less about punishment and more about breaking the human will. But it wasn't always so brutal. Sometimes it was quieter, psychological. Darkness, isolation, and hunger could make anyone confess to anything. Some prisoners would start confessing before the first question was even asked, just to get it over with. In some towns, confession was treated almost like performance, a final story before death. They'd dress the condemned in clean clothes, parade them through the streets, and have them speak their sins aloud before the crowd. People would nod, pray, or just stare, waiting for the end. For medieval people, justice was never just about fairness. It was about order, making sure everyone saw what happened to those who stepped out of line. Fear was the glue that kept society from falling apart. Tyburn, for example, was so famous that people planned their days around executions. Vendors sold snacks, kids ran through the crowd, and the condemned gave short speeches, some serious, some sarcastic, some even funny. One thief reportedly said, "Gentlemen, I am going to where I shall see none of you again," and then bowed before the rope tightened. Each one said, "This is what happens when you steal, when you lie, when you break the king's peace." But behind the lesson was something darker, curiosity. People watched because it was the only drama available. It was like a medieval version of reality TV, except the contestants never came back. And yet, even in this grim world, some condemned people became oddly famous. They were called gallows saints, criminals who repented so passionately, so dramatically, that people began to see them as holy. There were even rumors of miracles, the rope breaking at the last second, or the body refusing to rot. Sometimes, the crowd would start collecting bits of the rope as relics. Imagine that. One moment you're a thief, the next you're a saint, just because your execution was extra emotional. Some ended in mutilation. If you gossiped, they'd put a scold's bridle on your head, an iron cage with a little spike that pressed against your tongue, so every word hurt. It sounds cruel now, but to them, it was balance, a visible way to mark sin and consequence. Then there were the stocks and pillories, public humiliation machines. They were set up right in the middle of town squares. You'd be locked in arms and head, poking through wooden holes, and left there for hours or days. Some would taunt you, others would preach. It was justice as entertainment, and everyone got a front row seat. Sometimes, the crowd didn't just watch, they joined in. If someone was hated enough, the people would take matters into their own hands. Witches, thieves, suspected heretics, all could be dragged out of their homes, beaten, or worse. The church officially condemned it, but quietly, it understood. Fear kept people in line, and nothing spread fear like public punishment. Some managed to escape, even from impossible situations. In the year 1360, a prisoner in the Tower of London named Ranulph Higden supposedly dug his way out using a broken spoon. Others bribed guards, faked illnesses, or swapped clothes with priests. A few even joined the very people who'd arrested them, turning from criminal to executioner, because apparently, career changes were flexible back then. And here's a strange twist. Executioners themselves were often seen as half criminals, half saviors. People feared them, avoided them, but also depended on them. They lived on the edge of society, usually outside the town walls. They couldn't join guilds or marry freely, but everyone needed them when the time came. It's an odd kind of loneliness to be essential but unwanted. Some executioners passed the job down through generations. Fathers teaching sons how to swing a sword cleanly, how to comfort the condemned, how to stay invisible afterward. There's one famous story from Nuremberg about an executioner who kept a private diary recording every punishment he ever carried out. In between the gruesome details, he'd write about his family, his garden, and how he preferred to use sharp blades because dull ones make a mess. Reading it now feels surreal, like finding tenderness in the middle of horror. And yet, amid all this, people still found ways to laugh, to survive, to bend the rules. Petty crimes, human errors, the little rebellions that made life bearable. Because for all the talk of divine justice, most medieval people understood one thing very clearly. You could pray for heaven, but you had to live on earth. As the centuries rolled on, punishments began to change. Cities grew, laws got stricter, and some kings realized maybe terror wasn't the most efficient legal system. By the late 1400s, some prisons even had written rules: clean straw, scheduled meals, and guards who weren't allowed to randomly hit you. But superstition still lingered like smoke in the rafters. People believed in omens, black cats crossing the road before a trial, candles that flickered during confession, strange dreams the night before sentencing. It was a world where guilt could feel contagious, like a sickness that spread through rumor. If the wrong person pointed a finger, your life could unravel before you even opened your mouth. And in that fragile balance between guilt and innocence, fear became its own kind of currency. Confession became both spiritual and political. The safest way to stay alive was to admit you were wrong, even if you weren't. It's hard not to imagine how many criminals went to their deaths, whispering apologies they never should have had to make. The wind outside the dungeon sighs against the stone. A torch flickers. Somewhere, a bell tolls midnight, and for a moment, you can almost feel the weight of that age, 1,000 years of fear and faith. Law and sin, tangled together like ivy on a crumbling wall. The guards will sleep soon, their helmets resting on wooden stools, their boots by the fire. But the prisoners stay awake, listening to the slow drip of water in the dark, counting each sound as if it could measure time itself. And in that stillness, one of them might whisper a prayer, not for mercy, but for memory, because even the condemned, somewhere deep inside, wanted to be remembered, to not vanish completely into the dirt and dust of history. And somehow, they weren't forgotten. Their names, scratched into prison walls, written in court records, whispered in taverns, they survived. Maybe that's the strangest kind of justice of all. Not the rope or the sword, but the story that comes after. The one we're still telling now, hundreds of years later, while the world sleeps. So if your eyes are getting heavy, that's okay. The story will wait. The outlaws, the thieves, the forgotten souls, they're still here. Patient as always, hiding between the lines of old parchment. And we've only just begun to meet them. The fire burns low, a quiet orange glow licking at the blackened wood. Somewhere outside, hooves echo against wet cobblestone, and for a moment you might think it's just a traveler passing by. But in medieval towns, movement after dark wasn't usually innocent. Those footsteps might belong to someone carrying secrets or stolen goods. As the Middle Ages matured, crime began to grow more organized. The lonely outlaw hiding in the forest started giving way to something more complicated. Webs of thieves, smugglers, and black market traders who turned chaos into an economy. In cities like London, Paris, Florence, and Venice, markets never truly slept. Even after the stalls closed and honest merchants went home, others slipped through the same streets, selling things that weren't supposed to exist. Stolen silver, forged documents, relics that had definitely never been touched by a saint, but came with an excellent sales pitch. There were codes for everything, hand signs, whistles, certain words whispered in the right tavern. You didn't just buy illegal things. You found the right person, asked in the right way, and made sure no one was listening. Because punishment for fencing stolen goods was nearly as harsh as the crime itself. And yet, people couldn't help themselves. The profits were just too tempting. A stolen necklace could buy a winter's worth of bread. A forged seal could get a merchant through 3 tax stations unharmed. A little black market deal could mean the difference between ruin and comfort. Even monasteries weren't immune. Monks brewed beer, sold wine, copied manuscripts, and sometimes those manuscripts mysteriously disappeared before delivery. The church often blamed demons, But honestly, most demons probably had better things to do than steal parchment. Then there were the beggars' guilds, yes, real ones. By the late medieval period, large cities had so many beggars that they started forming loose organizations. Some controlled who could beg where. Some even had rules. You had to be genuinely crippled or sick to take certain prime spots. And if you weren't, well, they'd make sure you were. Chroniclers described fake beggars who carried little props, crutches, bandages, or jars of fake tears made with onion juice. Others memorized tragic stories to make their pleas more convincing. My master died, my wife was taken by plague, my children starved. Sometimes it was true, sometimes not. But in a world without police, hospitals, or social safety nets, the line between crime and survival blurred until no one could tell the difference anymore. Still, the underground world had its own rules. Loyalty mattered, silence mattered even more. The punishment for betrayal wasn't a fine, it was a knife in the dark. Smugglers were another breed entirely. They thrived along the coasts, from the grey shores of England to the glittering Mediterranean. Salt was a favorite target. It was heavily taxed, and people always needed it. In France, smugglers moved it by the ton, dodging patrols and bribing officials. Some even became local heroes, known as faux soigneurs, the saltmen who defied the king's tax collectors. Then there were the relic smugglers, a special kind of spiritual criminal. During the Crusades and pilgrimages, relics became an industry. A fingerbone of St. Peter here, a splinter from the true cross there. So many holy fragments circulated that by the 1300s, you could have built an entire church out of them. Pilgrims would pay good money to touch or see these objects, believing they carried miracles. Some relics were genuine, but many were clever forgeries. There's even a story of one man who sold vials of Mary's milk, which, upon inspection, turned out to be candle wax. Still, people bought it. Faith, after all, was stronger than logic. And when faith mixes with money, crime follows close behind. As towns grew wealthier, they also became riskier. Night watchmen patrolled the streets with torches, but they couldn't be everywhere. Dark alleys, narrow bridges, abandoned chapels, all perfect hiding places for thieves. The wealthier the city, the hungrier the underworld became. In Florence, entire neighborhoods became known for certain trades. Some made silk, some worked metal, others quietly, at night, made counterfeit coins. It was called clipping, shaving tiny bits of silver or gold from coins and melting them down. The practice was so common that kings had to keep redesigning their currency just to stop it. And yet, counterfeiters were often admired, in secret. It took skill, precision, and nerves of steel. You weren't just a thief, you were an artist, one mistake away from hanging. By the way, hanging wasn't always immediate. Sometimes, they'd first drag you through the streets to remind everyone what you'd done. The crowd would cheer, jeer, or simply yawn. It depended on how interesting you were. Crime, in a strange way, had become its own kind of theater. Even the church had its own scandals. Corruption spread like ivy, bishops taking bribes, priests running gambling rings, monasteries hiding fugitives for a fee. There's a letter from the 14th century complaining about holy men who spent more time in taverns than at the altar. You can almost hear the sigh in the ink. And sometimes, crime reached the very top, into the royal courts. Kings and queens had their own secrets, and their own ways of hiding them. Take, for example, the assassination of Edward II of England. Officially, he died in prison in 1327, after being deposed. Unofficially, rumors said he was murdered by his own captors, on the orders of his wife and her lover. The details were too gruesome to repeat, and historians still argue over what really happened, but the whispers never faded. Royal murders were their own kind of legend. They were whispered in corridors, written in coded letters, painted into poems. In France, there was the scandal of the Tour de Nesle, a story of queenly infidelity and brutal executions that shook the royal family. In Italy, families like the Visconti and the Sforza built empires out of assassination and betrayal. Politics wasn't separate from crime. It was crime, dressed in silk and Latin. And then there was the Black Death, the 14th century's great eraser. When plague struck, laws broke down, cities emptied, priests fled, and in the chaos, thieves flourished. Bodies were left in the streets, houses stood abandoned, and bandits looted freely. Some even dressed as priests or doctors to move without suspicion. For a brief, terrible time, Crime became the only order left, but out of that darkness, new systems emerged. Cities began hiring professional constables, creating early police forces. Towns built watchtowers, posted curfews, and formed night patrols. It was the beginning of organized law enforcement, though it often felt more like organized bullying. Still, it was progress, in the medieval sense, slightly less chaos. Meanwhile, the underworld adapted again. Thieves invented slang to confuse guards. They used coded songs to communicate across towns. In some places, criminals even had secret tattoos or marks to recognize each other. And beneath it all, there was a strange sense of honor. Steal from the rich, never the poor. Don't betray a fellow thief. Never harm a child or a priest, though not everyone followed that rule. The idea of the honorable criminal, dangerous but noble, was taking shape. It sessed the same romantic seed that later gave us the idea of pirates with moral codes and bandits who only robbed the greedy. Probably wasn't true most of the time, but it made the stories easier to tell, because people needed those stories. They needed to believe that even in a cruel world, justice could exist, if not in the courts, then at least in the shadows. And maybe, in some strange way, that belief made the world a little less terrifying. The wind picks up again, brushing through the cracks in the stone. Somewhere far away, a church bell marks the hour, one slow, echoing note that fades into the night. The city sleeps. The guards yawn. And in a quiet tavern tucked behind an alley, a man counts his stolen coins by candlelight, smiling softly. He's not rich, not safe, not powerful, but for one more night, he's free. And maybe that's all any of them ever wanted. Let's leave the alleys for a moment and walk toward the sea. You can almost smell it: salt, tar, wet rope, the faint rot of old fish clinging to the air. The medieval port was its own living creature, half order, half chaos. Ships creaked like restless bones, gulls screamed above, and sailors sang songs about things you definitely couldn't repeat in polite company. Ports were the beating hearts of medieval trade, but also the arteries through which crime pulsed constantly. Wherever money and goods gathered, thieves followed like shadows. Ships came from all over the Hanseatic cities of the north: Genoa, Venice, Lisbon, Bristol, bringing spices, silk, grain, and rumors. You could buy a bolt of linen or a rumor about a rebellion with equal ease. Dockside taverns were the true marketplaces of crime. A sailor could sell a stolen crate of wine to a tavern keeper who'd forget where it came from. A mercenary could trade a bloody dagger for a bed and a meal. And always, somewhere in the corner, there'd be a man who could make things disappear or appear for the right coin. Pirates were the celebrities of this underworld, not the flamboyant movie kind with parrots and eyeliner, but rough, desperate men, and sometimes women who lived by a simple rule: what you can take, you keep. In the early medieval period, piracy was almost considered a normal profession, a side job for sailors when trade was slow. Kings would even hire them as privateers, legalizing their theft in exchange for loyalty. A pirate, in one century, might be a knight in the next. Allegiance was flexible. Profit was eternal. Along the English Channel, Norse descendants known as sea-wolves preyed on merchant ships. In the Mediterranean, Catalan corsairs and Saracen raiders plundered coasts with frightening efficiency. Their attacks were sudden. One moment the horizon was calm, the next it was black with sails. For coastal towns, this was a nightmare that came and went, like the tide. One day the market would buzz with trade. The next, it would be ash and silence. Pirates rarely took prisoners unless they were worth ransom, and in the Middle Ages, everyone was worth something. The medieval world was obsessed with ransom. Nobles, merchants, even monks if captured, they could be sold back for a price. It became so normalized that there were official negotiators who specialized in buying people's freedom. It was business cloaked as mercy. But piracy wasn't always about gold. Sometimes it was about revenge. Sailors cheated of pay, captains betrayed by their crews, outlaws exiled from land. The sea became their last refuge. The line between survival and villainy blurred with every wave. There's a story from the 13th century about a pirate known only as Eustace the Monk, a former Benedictine turned outlaw. He terrorized the English Channel for years, switching sides between France and England depending on who paid more. He disguised his ships with false flags, raided monasteries, and outsmarted royal navies multiple times before finally being captured and executed. His last words, reportedly, were, "Tell the sea I'll be back." It said his ghost haunted the cliffs near Dover, where fishermen claimed to see a shadow walking on the waves. Whether true or not, it's the kind of story that kept children indoors and adults awake at night. And of course, every pirate needs a market. That's where the receivers came in, respectable-looking merchants who bought stolen goods. They dressed well, attended church, and pretended their wealth came from trade. In truth, their ledgers were filled with ink as dark as the crimes they hid. Smuggling, meanwhile, became an art form. Along the French and English coasts, entire families made their living hiding contraband. Wine, salt, spices, even people, anything that could be moved quietly had value. Caves and coves became warehouses. Locals built fake walls in barns or lowered crates into wells to avoid detection. When tax collectors came, they'd smile and pour them a drink, the same drink they hadn't paid taxes on. Sometimes, the smugglers and officials even worked together. A cut of the profit bought silence. A favor traded here, a warning whispered there. It wasn't law versus crime, it was negotiation. The medieval world ran on bribes and bargains just as much as it did on prayers and punishments. And while the sea brought riches and ruin inland, other crimes were evolving in darker forms, not for gold or survival, but for power. Poisonings became the new fashion among nobles who wanted their rivals gone without a messy war. It was clean, discreet, and left room for plausible deniability. Venice, Florence, and Rome became laboratories of quiet death. Powders slipped into wine, rings designed to release venom, perfumes laced with toxins, the tools of the aristocratic assassin. The Borgia family, infamous for their political intrigues, supposedly perfected the art. Historians still argue how much of that reputation was real and how much was gossip. But either way, it worked. People feared them, and fear is its own kind of weapon. In England, rumors swirled of nobles dying suddenly at feasts, choking on a grape that might have been more than a grape. And every suspicious death added to the growing paranoia of the upper classes. Meals became cautious affairs. Wine tasters were common. Even kings refused food unless it came from trusted hands. One of the most infamous cases of suspected poisoning was that of John of Gaunt's son, Henry, Duke of Gloucester, who died under mysterious circumstances in 1397 after falling out of favor with Richard II. Some said it was natural illness. Others whispered otherwise. The thing about poison is, it leaves no witness. And yet, not every killer hid in shadows. Some wanted to be seen, to be feared, to be remembered. Guy Lederace, for instance, was a nobleman who fought alongside Joan of Arc, a hero of France, celebrated for bravery and wealth. But after the wars ended, something inside him cracked. In the 1440s, he was accused of unspeakable crimes: abduction, murder, the ritual killing of children. The details were so horrific that even hardened soldiers wept hearing them. He was executed, but his legend survived, half historical, half demonic, blurring the line between monster and man. It's disturbing how fascination often follows horror. Even centuries later, people still whisper his name, drawn to the darkness he left behind. Maybe because he embodied something timeless, the truth that evil doesn't always wear rags. Sometimes it wears silk and smiles. As you drift deeper into this world, you start to see a pattern. Medieval crime wasn't just about greed. It was about the struggle for control over money, over fear, over fate itself. Whether you were a pirate, a poisoner, or a peasant thief, you were playing against the same odds: survive in a system designed to crush you. And in that sense, every criminal was a reflection of the society that created them. A mirror held up to power, showing what desperation could make of a human being. Back at the port, the sea whispers again. The tide pulls away from the shore, dragging secrets with it. The ships groan softly, as if remembering every sin they've carried: blood-stained planks, hidden prisoners, stolen goods. Somewhere, a lantern sways in the dark, and the night folds itself over the water like a shroud. For most people, it's just another night. For the underworld, it's business as usual. Morning in a medieval city didn't always start with birdsong. Sometimes it began with the slow, rhythmic thump of wooden wheels and the murmurs of a gathering crowd. In the square, a platform waited. Wooden beams, rope, iron chains. Justice was about to wake up. The public execution wasn't just punishment, it was performance. A grim kind of theater where everyone knew the ending, but they still came for the show. Bakers, children, nobles, and beggars alike stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting to see the hand of law deliver its message. It was a warning dressed as entertainment, a ritual that said, "This is what happens when you cross the rules." Executioners were central to this strange play. Men both feared and needed, cursed and protected. They often lived on the edge of towns, away from others. Their touch was said to bring bad luck, but their work brought order, at least, according to the crown. Most of them weren't sadists. Many saw themselves as public servants, carrying the burden others wouldn't. Their job was precise, even technical. A good executioner could take a head cleanly in one strike, sparing the condemned unnecessary suffering and the crowd unnecessary boredom. A bad one might take 2 or 3 swings. In such cases, the audience would groan or even jeer, throwing rotten food. Medieval justice was cruel, but it had its standards. Still, death wasn't always by sword or rope. Some crimes deserved more spectacle. Thieves might be branded or have an ear cut off. Adulterers were paraded through streets, tarred with feathers, humiliated for everyone to see. Counterfeiters could be boiled alive in their own molten metal. Every punishment carried a message, carved in flesh or flame. And yet, even the condemned had fans. Some became folk heroes, ordinary people crushed by an unjust system, whose final words turned into legend. A thief who mocked his captors on the gallows could become a street song by nightfall. A heretic who refused to recant could become a saint in secret. The medieval crowd might cheer the execution in daylight and pray for the soul of the executed by candlelight. But for every public death, there were quieter endings: assassinations, betrayals, secret poisonings behind stone walls. The kind of crimes whispered about but never proven. The kind that made kings paranoid and servants disappear. Take the story of the princes in the Tower. In 1483, 2 young heirs to the English throne, Edward V and his brother Richard, were placed in the Tower of London for protection by their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Not long after, they vanished. No trial, no witness, no bodies ever found. When Richard crowned himself king, people began to whisper. The boys were never seen again, and their disappearance haunted England for centuries. Some said they were smothered in their sleep. Others believed they escaped. And maybe, somewhere in those cold stone corridors, the truth still lingers, hidden behind layers of history and guilt. Royal murder was never simple. In the medieval mind, kings ruled by divine right, chosen by God himself. Killing a king wasn't just treason, it was blasphemy. Yet, ironically, many kings met their end at the hands of their own kin or courtiers. Consider Edward II of England. Deposed by his wife, Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, he was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle and later found dead. The rumor that he was killed with a red-hot poker inserted in an unspeakable place might not be true, but it spread fast, because scandal always travels faster than truth. All looked to Scotland. In 1437, King James I was murdered by a group of conspirators, led by his own relatives. They trapped him in a sewer drain beneath the palace floor. He'd tried to escape through a tunnel, but days earlier he'd ordered it sealed to stop tennis balls from rolling in. Fate has a cruel sense of humor. Europe was filled with such ironies: poison in the wine, daggers in the dark, letters sealed with wax and betrayal. Behind every royal smile was a knife waiting for its cue. And then there was Joan of Arc, perhaps the most tragic example of medieval justice gone wrong. A teenage peasant girl who claimed divine visions. She rallied France against English occupation, helped crown a king, and changed the course of war. But once her usefulness faded, politics turned on her. Captured by Burgundian allies of the English, she was put on trial not as a soldier, but as a heretic. The court was stacked, the verdict predetermined. She was burned alive in 1431, and the witnesses later claimed her heart would not burn, a symbol, perhaps, of the truth refusing to die. Centuries later, the same church that condemned her would declare her a saint. That's medieval justice in a nutshell: brutal, circular, and occasionally remorseful. Just centuries too late. But not all power struggles ended in blood. Some criminals wore crowns and robes and never saw a day in chains. Corruption was the quietest and most accepted crime of all. Bribery oiled every system. Need a trial to go your way. Pay want a tax reduced. Pay want your enemy accidentally forgotten in prison. Pay. Even judges took bribes disguised as gifts: a goose, a barrel of wine, a pouch of coins slipped under parchment. Everyone condemned corruption publicly, but practiced it privately. It was as medieval as bread and plague. And yet, in the middle of all this rot, there were sparks of humanity. Not every judge was cruel. Not every thief was wicked. A few brave souls tried to reform the system, to build prisons that rehabilitated instead of destroyed. They were rare, often mocked, and mostly ignored. But they planted the faint idea that maybe, someday, justice could mean mercy. Of course, that was still a long way off. In most towns, punishment was still the main form of entertainment. Traveling executioners would set up in the square like performers, cleaning their blades as children watched with wide, fascinated eyes. It's unsettling to imagine now, but for them, it was as normal as going to a market fair. In a world where death was everywhere, plague, famine, war, maybe it made sense to make peace with it. Maybe the public needed to see it to remember they were still alive. And so, the wheel turned quite literally. The breaking wheel was one of the most feared punishments in Europe. The condemned was tied to a wooden wheel, and their limbs smashed with iron bars before being left to die in the open air. It was meant to purify the soul through suffering, though most people just saw it as horror disguised as holiness. The church justified much of this with theology. Suffering cleansed sin. Public punishment preserved order. But beneath those sermons, you can almost hear the human voices, afraid, tired, confused. The same fear that makes people obey. The same fear that built cathedrals and prisons alike. And still, life went on. Bakers baked. Lovers met in secret. Pilgrims walked roads that sometimes crossed gallows fields. Crime never stopped, and neither did the attempts to control it. It was a dance, messy, tragic, and endlessly human. If you stand in an old European town square today, with tourists chatting and pigeons fluttering around statues, it's hard to imagine the same space once echoed with the cries of the condemned. But history never really disappears. It just changes costume. The stones remember. The air remembers. And sometimes, late at night, when the streets grow empty and the wind slides down the alleys, you can almost hear the faint echo of a crowd waiting for justice that never quite arrived. The wind changes as we step away from the gallows square. You can feel it, colder, thinner, as though the air itself carries suspicion. People lower their voices. Doors close earlier. Church bells ring not for prayer, but for warning. This is no longer the world of thieves and pirates. This is the world of sin and suspicion, where the crime isn't what you do, but what you believe. It begins quietly, as fear always does. A bad harvest, a sudden illness, a strange light in the sky, something that doesn't fit neatly into the world people understand. And when people can't explain something, they find someone to blame. In the Middle Ages, that someone was often a witch. Witchcraft wasn't a new idea, but it grew teeth in the late medieval centuries. Earlier, magic was just part of life. Charms to bless crops, herbs for healing, prayers mixed with old pagan rituals whispered in secret. But as the church's power grew, anything that didn't fit within its walls became suspect. A woman with too much knowledge of herbs, a man who read the stars too well, a midwife who delivered babies without a priest's blessing. They all became potential witches. Most accusations began small. A neighbor's cow died. A child fell ill. Someone mumbled that the old widow on the edge of the village had been seen muttering to herself. Maybe she looked at the wrong person too long. Maybe her bread rose better than anyone else's. Maybe she was just poor, strange, and alone. That was often enough. Soon, whispers turned into certainty. Certainty turned into evidence. And evidence, in the medieval world, could be as simple as a dream, a rumor, or the shape of a birthmark. Trials were grim theater. The accused was rarely allowed to speak freely. They'd be questioned by priests, often under the weight of chains or worse. Do you renounce the devil? Who taught you the craft? What creatures came to you in the night? There was no correct answer, because the trial wasn't meant to discover truth. It was meant to confirm fear. Torture was used, not as punishment, but as persuasion. The rack, the strappado, the boot, each designed to loosen joints and tongues. The inquisitors believed pain revealed honesty. In reality, it only revealed what a person thought their captors wanted to hear. Confessions were written, signed with trembling hands or marks of blood. The accused might name others, sometimes to save themselves, sometimes just to end the agony. That's how witch hunts spread, not like fire but like disease. And all the while, The church told itself it was cleansing the world of sin. The irony was almost poetic, trying to root out evil by becoming it. But not every so-called witch was a victim of hysteria. Some were cunning folk, healers, and wise women who genuinely practiced ancient rituals. They didn't see themselves as wicked. To them, it was survival, tradition, maybe even kindness. The church saw the devil. They saw medicine and mystery. Two worlds, staring at each other through the smoke. The most chilling part wasn't the burning pyres, it was the silence afterward. Villages went back to normal. People nodded to one another in markets, pretending they hadn't watched a neighbor die screaming the night before. History remembers the flames, but the real scar was the fear left behind. And then came the Inquisition. What started as a small movement to protect faith became a continent-wide network of investigation and control. The First Inquisition began in the 13th century, targeting heretics, people who disagreed with official church teachings. Later, it expanded like a shadow stretching across Europe. It wasn't always cruel at first. Some inquisitors genuinely believed they were saving souls. They saw themselves as physicians treating spiritual sickness. But power never stays gentle for long. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the Inquisition had become a machine, one fueled by suspicion, confession, and fire. Records from Spain, France, and Italy show thousands of cases. People accused of reading forbidden books, questioning the Trinity, even failing to attend Mass. Some were tortured until they confessed. Others confessed before the whip even touched them. The fear was contagious. People began turning in neighbors to prove their own loyalty. Better them than me. That became the quiet prayer of survival. Not even the powerful were safe. Scholars, nobles, even priests could fall. One wrong word, one letter misunderstood, one joke at the wrong dinner. The church's net was wide and patient. And yet, beneath that horror, you can glimpse something tragically human, the desperate need to make sense of a chaotic world. When disease, war, and famine struck, it was easier to believe someone caused it than to accept randomness. If evil had a face, it could be punished. If it could be punished, then maybe the world wasn't hopeless. That's the cruel comfort of scapegoats. They make fear feel manageable. The most notorious witch hunts came later, but the seeds were medieval. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, turned superstition into system. Written in the late 1400s, it claimed witches were real, mostly women, and always in league with the devil. It told inquisitors exactly how to find, question, and destroy them. It became one of the best-selling books of its time, second only to the Bible. Imagine reading that by candlelight, believing every word, and then looking out your window to see your neighbor's chimney smoke curl like a serpent. How long before suspicion turns into accusation? How long before a knock on the door turns into a fire? It's easy to think these people were foolish, that we'd never fall for such hysteria today. But fear doesn't vanish, it just changes shape. In every age, there's always someone to blame, always a story to make us feel safer about things we can't control. Back in the medieval village, the night grows thicker. The stars blur behind clouds, and the wind carries a faint smell, ash and rain. Somewhere, a church bell tolls for the soul of another sinner. A dog barks once, then stops. Silence settles again, and in the corner of that silence, someone whispers a prayer, not to God, not to the devil, but to no one in particular. Just a plea for tomorrow to come without another name on the list. The next morning, life goes on. Markets open. Children play. The world pretends nothing happened. That's the true genius of fear. It teaches people to forget, while remembering enough to obey. The irony is, while the church hunted witches, it often protected far more dangerous criminals. Nobles who slaughtered peasants, priests who stole tithes, rulers who started wars in the name of heaven. But those crimes had signatures too big to erase, so they were baptized as holy. Faith and fear, they were the twin hammers that shaped medieval justice. You can't separate them. To understand crime in that world, you have to understand belief itself. The same belief that built cathedrals also built pyres, and in some strange way, both were meant to reach the same God. The crackle of fire, the hush of prayer, the shadow of the cross flickering on stone. It's hard to tell whether it's salvation or damnation. Maybe it's both. Night deepens again. The wind moves through ruined chapels, rattling old doors, whispering through forgotten bones buried beneath churches. The echoes of the condemned, the accused, the lost, they never really left. They linger in the cracks of history, waiting for someone to listen. And now, here you are, listening. The thing about fear is that it's never satisfied. Once you start hunting witches, heretics aren't far behind. And in the medieval world, heresy was the most dangerous crime of all, not because of what it did, but because of what it questioned. To challenge the church wasn't just rebellion, it was cosmic treason. The universe itself had a hierarchy, God on top, kings and bishops beneath, and everyone else somewhere below the chickens. Questioning that order was like pulling a brick from the foundation of the entire world. That's how it started with the Cathars, southern France, 12th century. The sun there was warmer, the wine sweeter, and the people, well, they were a bit freer in their thoughts than the church liked. The Cathars believed in two gods, one of good and one of evil. To them, the material world, all flesh, gold and glory, belonged to the dark god. The true God was pure spirit, unreachable by the corruption of the earth. That meant no need for churches, no need for priests, no need for Rome, and that, right there, was their fatal mistake. The church called them heretics, but the Cathars called themselves the pure. They lived simply, avoided meat, refused to kill even animals, and treated men and women as equals, which was practically heresy by itself in the 1200s. They believed salvation came through personal purity, not confession or crusade. To medieval ears, that sounded like anarchy in disguise. At first, Rome tried preaching, then it tried persuasion, but when words failed, swords took their place. The Albigensian Crusade began in 1209, a holy war, not against Muslims or pagans, but against fellow Christians. The Pope declared it God's will, and soon, knights marched south under banners embroidered with crosses. They attacked towns that had harbored Cathars, Béziers, Carcassonne, Toulouse. Whole cities were put to the torch. The church's representative, when asked how to tell heretics from true believers, supposedly said, "Kill them all. God will know his own." That line still hangs in the air like smoke centuries later. Those who survived the sword faced the Inquisition, interrogations, torture, confessions, and the stake. The Cathar faith was burned out of existence, its last believers hunted into the mountains. In 1244, at the fortress of Montségur, the last stronghold fell. Over 200 Cathars were burned together in one great fire. And yet, the ashes of that rebellion lingered, because once an idea catches flame, it never really dies. It just hides in the cracks of history, waiting. Another shadow of heresy rose soon after the Knights Templar. They began as heroes, warrior monks sworn to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. They were brave, disciplined, and rich, too rich. Over 2 centuries, they built a network of castles, banks, and farms across Europe. Kings borrowed money from them, even nobles knelt for their loans. But when the Crusades faltered, the Templars' purpose dimmed. They still held power, but power without purpose makes enemies, especially kings who owed them gold. King Philip IV of France was one such debtor. He was broke, ambitious, and suspicious, a dangerous combination. So, in 1307, he struck on a single October morning. He ordered the arrest of every Templar in France. The charges: heresy, idolatry, blasphemy, witchcraft, the usual cocktail of sins you use when you want someone gone. They were accused of spitting on the cross, worshipping strange idols, kissing each other's feet in secret rituals. Half rumor, half political invention. Under torture, some confessed. Under torture, most people do. The order was dissolved, its lands taken. Its leaders, including Grand Master Jacques de Malle, were burned alive. As the flames rose, witnesses said de Malle cursed the king and the pope, summoning them to God's judgment within the year. And eerily enough, both men were dead within months. Whether or not the curse was real doesn't matter. The story was whispered through taverns, monasteries, and courts, proof that divine justice could still strike back. In a world ruled by fear, that thought was its own kind of rebellion. But rebellion, too, had many faces. Some wore crowns of thorns, others crowns of mud. Peasant revolts swept through medieval Europe like summer storms. The poor had always suffered, but the 14th century pushed them past breaking. War drained their fields, plague emptied their homes, and taxes, oh taxes, were relentless. When the Black Death ended, lords demanded the same labor as before, though half the workers were gone. Peasants began to ask dangerous questions. Why should we work the land if it's ours that feeds them? Why should we kneel if God made us the same? The church called it sin, the nobles called it treason, but the hungry just called it survival. In England, 1381, it boiled over. The peasants' revolt began not with swords, but with words, fiery sermons about justice and equality. A priest named John Ball preached that all men were born free, and asked, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? It was the kind of sentence that could start a revolution, and it did. Tens of thousands marched on London under the leadership of a man named Wat Tyler. They stormed prisons, burned tax records, and demanded the king meet them. The teenage King Richard II did, at first promising reforms, pardons, freedom, but promises are cheap when made from horseback. When Tyler approached too boldly in a parley, a royal officer stabbed him. As Tyler fell, the rebellion broke. Thousands were executed in the days that followed. Ball was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body cut into pieces and displayed across England. The message was clear. Mercy was for the powerful. Justice was for the grave. Still, the idea survived. It whispered through every tavern and village for centuries. The idea that power could be challenged, that kings and priests weren't unbreakable. Every time someone rebelled, every time someone whispered enough, the Middle Ages trembled a little. And yet, for all its blood and fear, the medieval world wasn't just cruelty, it was contradiction. The same church that burned heretics also built hospitals. The same kings who crushed peasants also funded cathedrals that reached for heaven. Humanity, in all its mess, couldn't choose between sin and sanctity, so it lived in both. At night, the villagers still prayed. They still sang. They still hoped that heaven was listening. But maybe the most dangerous rebels weren't on battlefields or in dungeons. Maybe they were the ones who simply thought differently. Philosophers, alchemists, wanderers, people who stared at the stars and saw not angels, but worlds. Men like Roger Bacon, who suggested the universe followed natural laws instead of miracles. Or women like Hildegard of Bingen, who wrote visions that danced between prophecy and poetry. These thinkers didn't swing swords, they wielded questions. And in a time when asking questions could be treason, that made them the quietest criminals of all. As we drift through this world of crime and faith, you start to feel the weight of it, how fragile belief really was, and how powerful it could become in the wrong hands. Heresy and holiness were sometimes only a breath apart. The moon rises over the ruins of Montségur, over the ashes of the Templars, over the silent fields where peasants once cried freedom. The night feels heavy with all their ghosts. If you listen closely, you can almost hear them, the whispers of the pure, the cursed, the forgotten. They're still asking the same question. Who decides what's sin and what's justice? And the truth, buried beneath centuries of smoke and silence, might just be that nobody ever really knew. When the church bells stopped tolling and the fires of heresy died down, what remained was the machinery of fear, smooth, silent, and efficient. The medieval world had learned that control didn't always need faith or armies. Sometimes it only needed walls, stone walls, iron locks, keys that turned with the sound of finality. That was the sound of medieval justice. Imagine walking through one of those old prisons, the kind that wasn't really built for humans, more like something between a cellar and a tomb, the air thick with rot and damp. You can't tell if it's day or night, because the only light slips in through cracks in the ceiling. Chains scrape softly, like restless ghosts, shifting in their sleep. This was the world of the medieval jailer. Prisons back then weren't like the ones we imagine now. Rows of cells, guards on patrol, regular meals. They weren't for serving time. They were for waiting for trial, for confession, or for execution. You didn't get sentenced to prison. You ended up in prison because your story wasn't finished yet. Some never finished at all. The Tower of London, the Châtelet in Paris, the Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome. These weren't just fortresses. They were statements. They told people what happened when you crossed power. Their stones heard things that history never wrote down. Screams, prayers, secrets. The jailers were an odd breed. Not quite villains, not quite victims. They lived between worlds, too cruel for pity, too necessary for blame. Some were merciful, others monsters. There were cases where prisoners bribed guards for better treatment, a candle, a blanket, a word, to the right person. But for most, mercy was expensive, and the poor rarely had anything left to trade. And then there was the torture chamber. Not every crime led there, but enough did that everyone feared it. The tools had names like grim poetry: the rack, the wheel, the thumbscrews, the boot, each one designed not to kill, but to open the body, the will, the truth, or something that sounded enough like truth to please the man holding the quill. There were rules technically. The church said torture could only last long enough to encourage confession and couldn't draw blood or cause permanent harm, which of course were rules only the imagination could enforce. Medieval interrogators were experts at stretching both tendons and definitions. The rack was a favorite, simple and horrifying. The victim's wrists and ankles tied to rollers, slowly turned until joints popped like knuckles. The sound was soft, almost polite. Some scribes wrote that it was like listening to parchment tear. Then there was the strappado, a rope tied behind the back, lifting the prisoner by the arms until shoulders dislocated. The pain was sharp, fast, blinding. Many fainted after a few minutes. When revived, they'd be asked again, "Do you confess?" The boot crushed legs between planks, wedges driven in with a mallet. Every strike drove truth closer to the surface, or so they said. And yet, for all the horror, there was a strange calm to the process. Records show interrogators describing it with clinical precision: how long the subject lasted, what they said when they cried out. It wasn't rage, it was routine. That's what makes it terrifying. Not that people were cruel, but that cruelty became ordinary. Executioners, too, lived in that twilight. They were both feared and needed. The church condemned killing, yet someone had to swing the sword. So the job went to men who stood outside society, part butcher, part priest of death. They were paid well, but shunned. No one wanted to shake their hand. Some executioners had to live outside city walls, their children forbidden from certain trades. But come the day of punishment, all eyes were on them. The crowd gathered early, as if for a fair. Vendors sold bread and ale. Parents lifted children to see. Justice, in the medieval mind, had to be seen to be believed. If you were lucky, it was quick, a sword or an axe, one clean stroke. But luck was rare. More often it was slow, public, and meant to teach. Thieves might lose a hand. Traitors were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Witches burned. Heretics strangled before the flames. Some punishments were almost poetic in their cruelty. Bakers who sold underweight loaves were baked themselves. Counterfeiters boiled in oil. False priests paraded in mock vestments. And yet, in some strange way, it wasn't just vengeance, it was ritual. The execution was seen as cleansing, restoring order to a world always teetering toward chaos. People watched and whispered prayers, not always for the condemned, but for themselves. Because in that moment, every execution was a reminder that sin could have a shape, a face, a body, and that it wasn't theirs. Not today. The executioner, when his work was done, often prayed to. Some records describe them kneeling beside the body, asking forgiveness. Others simply wiped their blade, pocketed their fee, and walked home. Another day finished, another soul released. Behind all this pageantry of pain was a single idea: confession. The church believed truth was sacred, and confession was the path to it. That belief justified nearly everything. If a person confessed before death, they could still be saved. The body might burn, but the soul could still rise. That was the loophole that made cruelty righteous. But not every confession came from torture. Some came from loneliness, from hunger, from despair. In the cold dark of the cell, a prisoner might begin to wonder if silence was really worth dying for, and sometimes they'd whisper to the walls instead. One letter, found centuries later in the Tower of London, was written by a prisoner awaiting death for treason. He wrote, "I am not sorry for my crime, only for being found. Yet I think God will forgive me, for he too knows what it is to be betrayed." It's hard to tell if that's arrogance or faith, maybe both. Justice in the Middle Ages wasn't about fairness, it was about order, keeping the world predictable, even if that predictability was cruel. As long as everyone knew their place, the world made sense. And yet, cracks always appeared. Sometimes the condemned refused to scream. Sometimes they forgave their executioners. Sometimes the crowd turned quiet, realizing too late that they might be watching themselves. Even kings weren't safe. In 1327, King Edward II of England, once powerful, now deposed, was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. His enemies wanted him gone but not martyred. So, legend says, they killed him with a red-hot iron inserted in a way too cruel to describe. It left no visible wound, only whispers. Whether true or not, it shows how the Middle Ages understood power, not as something divine, but dangerous. You could wear a crown one day, and chains the next. The line between criminal and victim blurred in those cells. Some deserved punishment. Many didn't, but once the keys turned, no one cared. The record books grew heavy with names, and the world moved on. Still, some voices survived. Graffiti scratched into walls, prayers, names, drawings of crosses or ships or suns, tiny messages saying, "I was here, I existed." It's strange to think how many of those marks were made by hands now long gone, their stories erased, except for those faint lines of dust. But maybe that's the quiet mercy of history. It forgets enough for us to sleep. When you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, the faint drip of water from a dungeon ceiling, the shuffle of chains, the sigh of someone who knows morning will never come. And somewhere above, in a bright hall full of golden incense, someone prays for justice, never realizing it's already kneeling in the dark. Below, if you were to walk through a medieval town at dawn, when the streets were still misted with chimney smoke and dew, you might see him, a man walking alone, wrapped in a heavy cloak. People would glance up as he passed, and then quickly look away. No one greeted him, no one offered bread, but everyone knew who he was. He was the executioner. He might live outside the city walls, near the tanner's yard or the potter's field. His house would be simple, but always apart. Even the wind seemed to hesitate before crossing his threshold. Inside, you'd find his tools, not of war, not of craft, but of judgment. A gleaming sword or axe for beheadings, a coil of rope for hangings, irons and branding rods, sometimes a block worn smooth by years of service. Each instrument cleaned carefully, not out of respect for the dead, but because a dull blade could make death last longer than it should. Executioners had many names: headsman, hangman, master of high justice, but whatever you called him, he was both servant and sinner. He did what others couldn't bear to watch. He made the invisible laws of God and King visible again, one body at a time. To the people, he was cursed. Children were warned not to look him in the eye. Women crossed themselves as he passed. But when punishment day came, the same people crowded the square early, eager to see the work of his hands. There's something unsettlingly human about that, our ancient fascination with justice wrapped in spectacle. The crowd wanted to see sin defeated, to feel that the world was right again. The executioner made that feeling real. He'd arrive early, inspect the scaffold, test the ropes. If it was a beheading, he'd sharpen his blade on a whetstone, testing its edge with a hair. The condemned would be brought in chains, pale, sometimes praying, sometimes silent. A priest would murmur the final rites, the crowd would hold its breath, and the executioner, quiet, methodical, would do what had to be done. If he was good, it was over in a heartbeat. The sword flashed, the crowd gasped, the priest whispered, and life ended neatly, as though the body itself agreed. But when the blade missed or the rope snapped, horror replaced order. There are records of botched executions that haunted whole towns. In 1531, a man in Germany was to be beheaded, but the executioner missed again and again, 7 blows before it was done. The crowd turned on him, nearly tearing him apart. The man had failed at his sacred duty, to make death clean. So yes, even the man who killed for justice could himself be punished for doing it poorly. There was a strange sense of balance to that. But beneath the rituals and blood, there was something else, something quieter. Many executioners kept journals, if they could write, recording the names and the dates, but also their thoughts. One wrote, "I think of each man I kill, and I pray for him when I sleep. I think if I stop praying, God might forget me too." That's the part of the story history often forgets, the humanity hidden under the hood. There were executioners who tried to bring mercy to their work. Some gave the condemned wine to steady their nerves. Some whispered last words of comfort before the axe fell. A few even performed small acts of rebellion, loosening ropes, dulling irons, sparing a young thief's fingers when no one was looking. But mercy was dangerous. Justice had no patience for compassion. Executioners often passed their trade from father to son. It was one of the few professions that didn't require permission from a guild. No one else wanted it. In Germany, families like the Reindls and Frances served as hereditary executioners for centuries. Their names whispered with a mix of fear and gratitude. Their children went to separate schools. Their wives were refused communion. Yet when plague came or riots broke out, it was the executioner people sought, because they were also healers. Strange, isn't it? The man who ended lives was often the one who could save them. You see, executioners knew anatomy better than most doctors. They'd handled more bodies, seen more wounds. Some used that knowledge to treat the sick, mixing herbs and bombs, setting bones, even performing amputations. Their houses became half apothecary, half shadowed shrine. It's easy to forget that the medieval world wasn't divided neatly between good and evil, holy and damned. Sometimes they shared the same roof. There's a story from 16th century France. An executioner named Sassin, said to have healed a plague victim with herbs only he knew. When asked where he learned the recipe, he simply replied, "From the dying." He wasn't being poetic. He meant it literally. After an execution, the body was often dissected by surgeons or used in folk medicine. People believed the fat of a hanged man could cure joint pain, that his hand could bring luck at cards. Executioners sold such relics quietly, supplementing their income with superstition. The line between justice and witchcraft blurred again, as it so often did. By night, their homes were silent. The tools washed, the blood scrubbed clean, the town asleep. The executioner sat by the fire, maybe with a cup of wine, staring at his hands, the same hands that had built the gallows, sharpened the blade, ended the day. He might have felt pride, he might have felt nothing, or maybe, deep down, he wondered whether God watched him work, or turned away. On feast days, he stood apart in church, unblessed during processions. His place was at the very back. If he touched someone by accident, they'd make the sign of the cross. But when justice was needed, when order had to be restored, all eyes turned to him again. There's a strange rhythm to that kind of isolation. It's a life measured in sins you didn't commit, but still had to carry. Some towns built their scaffolds permanently, right in the market square, so the people never forgot what justice looked like. The wood darkened with time, the steps worn smooth by countless feet. For the executioner, it was both workplace and altar. He didn't kill for pleasure, not usually. He killed because the world demanded it, because someone had to hold the blade steady while everyone else looked away. That's what made him necessary and unholy. As the centuries passed, the ritual softened. Fewer tortures, quicker deaths, more rules. But the executioner remained, his shadow lengthening through history. Even when the scaffold gave way to the guillotine, he was still there, faceless, nameless, part of the machinery. And when the people finally decided they no longer needed him, when execution became an act of the state instead of a man, he simply faded away, leaving behind empty squares, clean laws, and a silence that felt heavier than before. Because, for all its cruelty, there was something brutally honest about the medieval executioner. He didn't pretend justice was clean. He knew it was soaked in blood. Now, if you walk through one of those old towns, you can still find the stones where he stood. They're worn smooth, but if the light hits just right, you can almost see it, the faint red stain that history never fully washed away. Maybe that's why the past lingers. Not because we can't forget it, but because deep down, we know it's still part of us. The crowd is gone, the blade is rusted, but the need to see wrongs punished that remains. We just call it something else now. And somewhere, in that quiet space between punishment and mercy, you can still feel him, the man in the cloak, sharpening his blade before dawn, humming softly so he doesn't have to hear his own thoughts. Justice, in the end, is just another name we give to fear. Because back then, justice wasn't about fairness, it was about surviving the spectacle. The more shocking the punishment, the more people would whisper, "Maybe I shouldn't steal that chicken," and somehow, that was considered an effective policy. Let's drift now toward the shadowy world of the professional outlaw, the kind of person who decided that obeying laws was just too mainstream. You see, in the 14th and 15th centuries, England, France, and even parts of the Holy Roman Empire had these wild forests and crumbling roads that were, basically, open invitations for bandits. Think of them as the influencers of crime. Everyone knew their names. Half the peasants hated them, and the other half quietly cheered them on because at least they were robbing the rich. And perhaps the most famous among them was Robin Hood, or rather, the many people who probably inspired the legend of Robin Hood. Now, the bedtime version of him is all green tights, archery contests, and merry feasts under oak trees. But the historical Robin Hoods were rough, desperate men. sometimes veterans from wars who came home to find no food, no pay, and no land. So they turned to the woods, where bows and blades could earn them more than loyalty to a king ever did. The earliest mentions of a robohod or rabenhod appear in medieval legal records as nicknames given to thieves and bandits. It's almost as if Robin Hood became a label for outlawry itself, like a medieval meme. By the 13th century, clerks were writing it into court rolls. Captured one Robert Hood, called Robohod, a notorious thief. So maybe there was never a single man with a heart of gold, just a long line of desperate souls who fit the story. Imagine that. Somewhere in a cold English forest, a man hiding behind a tree with an arrow ready, thinking, they'll never catch me, while centuries later, he becomes a bedtime hero for stealing bread. History really has a funny way of polishing its criminals. But not all medieval outlaws got ballads sung about them. Some, like Eustace the monk, were less noble thief and more chaotic pirate wizard. I'm not joking, Eustace was a 13th century French monk who ditched the monastery, accused a count of murdering his father, and decided to take revenge by becoming a pirate in the English Channel. Eustace used disguises, trickery, and outright sorcery, rumors to terrify sailors. One chronicle said he could be in two places at once. In reality, he was just really good at escaping. He raided ports, smuggled goods, and occasionally switched sides between England and France, whichever paid better. In the end, he was caught and beheaded in 1217. His head was displayed on a ship's mast, which, honestly, feels like a medieval way of saying, unsubscribe. These weren't isolated stories. Across Europe, there were countless men and women who became infamous for testing the limits of law, from the German Robinites who plundered travelers in the Rhine Valley, to the Scottish reivers who raided cattle across the borderlands. Each had their own reasons: survival, revenge, greed. But they all shared one truth. Crime in medieval times was in tea and underground business. It was an outdoor performance. Now, of course, not all notorious criminals were rugged forest dwellers. Some wore fine robes, dined with nobles, and poisoned people for a living. Meet Tofana, Giulia Tofana, if you prefer her full name, the woman whose makeup could kill you. In 17th century Italy, which was still very medieval in spirit, Giulia Tofana became infamous for selling a beauty product called Acqua Tofana. It was a cosmetic liquid that promised a youthful glow but had a secret ingredient: arsenic. Her main customers, women who wanted to get rid of their abusive husbands. The mixture was odorless, tasteless, and worked slowly, making it look like a natural illness. Tofana and her network of assistants reportedly helped hundreds of women find freedom, one sip of poisoned soup at a time. Eventually, suspicion caught up. During interrogation, she allegedly confessed to helping over 600 murders. People whispered that her ghost still haunted Roman kitchens. Imagine that, the first woman to weaponize the beauty industry, centuries before anyone invented eyeliner commercials. And then there was Gilles de Rais, a name that makes even medieval chroniclers shudder. A wealthy French nobleman, companion of Joan of Arc, and later, one of history's first recorded serial killers. He lived in a castle dripping with gold and terror. He was said to have lured children from villages, committing crimes so dark that even hardened soldiers could barely describe them. When he was finally tried, the courtrooms were packed, and people wept, not out of pity but relief. Gilles's story became tangled with myth, morality, and horror, inspiring later tales like Bluebeard, the nobleman who murdered his wives. And it reminds us that beneath the chivalric poetry and shining armor of the Middle Ages, there were still shadows, deep, silent, and human. But sometimes, the criminals were created by the system itself. Peasants pushed to desperation during famine or plague were branded as thieves for stealing bread or hunting deer on royal land. A hungry farmer could be hanged for killing a rabbit that wandered too close to his starving family. Meanwhile, a baron could murder a servant and simply pay a fine. Justice wasn't blind, it was squinting at your social class. Still, for the common people, tales of outlaws and rebels became a strange form of comfort. They whispered about the good robber, the one who stole from the rich and punished the cruel. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were quiet acts of rebellion, told by firelight after long days in fields. A reminder that even if the world was unfair, at least in the stories, justice could bend. Now imagine you're drifting off to sleep in a small medieval cottage, wrapped in coarse wool, listening to those whispered stories of outlaws in the forest, pirates on the sea, and poisoners in distant cities. The wind outside rattles the shutters, and someone murmurs, "Did you hear? They caught another robber today." And just like that, bedtime in the Middle Ages wasn't about lullabies, it was about crime and consequence. But we're not done. There's one more kind of medieval criminal that deserves attention: the heretic and the rebel thinker. People who didn't steal gold or lives, they stole ideas. They challenged the church, questioned the king, or dared to think out loud. And in the medieval world, that was sometimes the most dangerous crime of all. Let's meet them next, the outlaws of the mind. While swords and hoods were busy enforcing law in the streets and forests, a different kind of criminal prowled the quiet corners of Europe, the criminal of thought. These were people whose ideas threatened power, who asked questions that no one dared answer aloud. To medieval authorities, questioning God or the king was no less dangerous than drawing a knife. In fact, it was often far worse. Take the Cathars again. Though we touched on them before, their story is deeper and more complex than public executions and pyres. They weren't violent. They didn't raid towns or steal livestock. Their crime was belief in a dualist universe where the material world was evil and only the soul was divine. They preached equality, simplicity, and refusal to swear oaths. To the church, this was like handing a loaded crossbow to a child: dangerous, unpredictable, deadly. The Inquisition hunted them relentlessly, but what's striking is how methodical the church was. The inquisitors didn't just seek confessions, they sought compliance. They wanted the Cathars to renounce, to repent, to perform obedience, even in thought. Those who refused were burned. Those who confessed sometimes lived at least long enough to testify against others. Fear, after all, is the most contagious disease. Then there were the Waldensians, followers of Peter Waldo, who preached simplicity and lay preaching in the 12th century. They refused to take church hierarchies seriously, insisting that every Christian could read and interpret the Bible themselves. For a church that controlled literacy and scripture, this was not just heresy, it was revolutionary. They were hunted across France and Italy, many fleeing to mountains or hidden valleys. Their persistence over centuries is remarkable. Even the Reformation centuries later owes something to their courage. But heresy wasn't always noble. Some criminals of thought dabbled in what the church labeled sorcery, alchemy, astrology, necromancy. Men and women who tried to peer behind the veil of nature risked life and limb. A single failed experiment could be enough to brand you as a magician, or worse, in league with the devil. Roger Bacon, the English philosopher, is one such figure. He studied optics, alchemy, and astronomy, making discoveries centuries ahead of his time. But his fascination with observation and experimentation made the church nervous. His writings were condemned as heretical, and for a time he was placed under house arrest. Imagine being imprisoned not for stealing or murdering, but for thinking too far ahead. Meanwhile, in Italy, Bruno of Nola would later push the boundaries of thought to the extreme, claiming the universe was infinite and that stars were other worlds, ideas so dangerous they eventually led to his execution. But the medieval seeds of fear for intellectual rebellion were already planted, centuries before Bruno walked the streets. Sometimes these thinkers were criminals, only in rumor. Monks whispered about women who could read ancient texts or translate them into common speech. They whispered about healers whose remedies seemed magical. They whispered about itinerant scholars carrying forbidden knowledge across borders. One wrong word, one glance at a forbidden book, and suddenly you were in chains. And yet, in many ways, these criminals were the lifeblood of medieval culture. Without them, Europe would have remained in the dark longer, trapped in ritual without understanding. Curiosity was criminal because it threatened control, but it also made history richer. Some were political criminals as much as intellectual ones. The Templars, we recall, were soldiers of faith, until they weren't. Their wealth, influence, and secrecy made them a target. King Philip IV of France accused them of heresy, blasphemy, and corruption, charges likely fabricated to justify confiscation of their vast riches. Still, in the eyes of the church, these men were sinners, criminals, even monsters, until the last was executed or imprisoned. It's fascinating to consider the difference between crime of the body and crime of the mind. Stealing, murdering, rebelling openly. Society had ways to punish that. But thinking differently, writing differently, believing differently, that was invisible, terrifying, impossible to regulate. And because it was invisible, the punishment was often louder, more dramatic, more permanent. Even those who tried to work quietly could not escape suspicion. Alchemists, for example, were part scientist, part magician, and part criminal in the eyes of local authorities. They promised to turn lead into gold, to discover elixirs of life, to summon hidden powers. Some succeeded in chemistry, unknowingly paving the way for future science. Others failed, and were burned for attempting to tamper with God's creation. Poisoners were another category of intellectual criminals. While their victims were often nobles or wealthy merchants, their methods were insidious. A drop of poison in wine, a tainted loaf of bread, or a cunningly placed powder could end lives silently. Unlike a thief or a robber, their work left no marks, only suspicion and whispers. Women in particular were often accused in these cases, whether guilty or not. Sometimes, as in the case of Julia Tofana, they were remarkably clever, making poisons almost undetectable, working behind the very walls of society that hunted them. Yet, as we drift deeper into this world of shadows, it's clear that medieval criminals weren't always bad people. Many were products of a rigid, often brutal system. Poverty, hunger, disease, and oppressive authority created fertile ground for both crime and rebellion. The line between victim and villain blurred constantly. One chronicler described a heretic captured in the Alps. He did not kill, he did not steal. He only read aloud from a forbidden book, and for that alone he must die. Yet when I saw him, I wondered who was truly guilty, he for reading, or we for fearing knowledge. That, perhaps, is the true terror of medieval crime. Not the act itself, but the power of authority to define guilt, to decide whose life mattered, and whose could be sacrificed to make fear concrete. As night falls over the hills and cities, the shadows of these thinkers, rebels, and heretics stretch long. They walk through history quietly, often without monuments, but never without impact. In their silence, you can feel the tension of a world struggling to understand itself, a world where crime wasn't always obvious, punishment wasn't always fair, and courage could be mistaken for criminality. And as you settle into your bed, listening to the wind rustle outside, remember this: the medieval world was full of criminals, yes, but some of the most notorious ones weren't the ones on the scaffold or in chains. They were the ones who dared to think, to question, and to push the boundaries of what was known. And that, perhaps, is the most dangerous crime of all. Even in a world obsessed with order, some people delighted in breaking it in the most terrifying ways imaginable. While kings and priests chased heretics, while executioners kept the streets safe, a few individuals operated in shadows darker than any dungeon. Killers whose cruelty became legend, poisoners whose subtle craft could topple households, and grave robbers who defiled the resting places of the dead. One of the earliest recorded serial killers of medieval Europe was Guyler de Race, a French nobleman we mentioned briefly before, whose crimes were as gruesome as they were shocking. Once a celebrated warrior who fought alongside Joan of Arc, Guyler's life descended into obsession and horror. He is believed to have lured hundreds of children to his castle, where he committed unimaginable atrocities. While some chroniclers debated the exact number of his victims, there was no doubt that his name became synonymous with evil. He was eventually executed in 1440, his wealth and title stripped away, but his story lingered, haunting generations, inspiring legends of Bluebeard and stories of the nobleman who killed in secret. Not all killers were nobles. Many operated from poverty or desperation, using fear as their currency. In late medieval England, for example, there were men and women who became known as boogeymen of the countryside, thieves who killed travelers on lonely roads, murderers who lurked near bridges or inns, and women who poisoned neighbors to claim inheritances. These criminals often became the foundation of local folklore. Children were warned that wandering into the forest could lead to being taken by some dark figure, but adults whispered tales with morbid fascination, curious to know who survived and who didn't. Poisoners, meanwhile, represented a more calculated, subtle form of crime. Unlike a robber or a murderer using brute force, poisoners killed quietly. Their weapon was chemistry, knowledge of herbs, or deadly compounds like arsenic and belladonna. One of the most infamous, as previously mentioned, was Julia Tofana, who distributed her aqua tofana to women seeking liberation from abusive husbands. Her elixir was slow-acting, odorless, tasteless, perfect for medieval discretion. Historians suggest that hundreds, perhaps even over 600, lives were ended this way, making her one of the most prolific poisoners in history. Poison wasn't always restricted to personal vendettas. Kings and nobles often employed it as a tool of political strategy. Italian city-states were notorious for plots and betrayals. Florence, Venice, and Milan had families that poisoned rivals to gain influence or wealth. The invisible hand of death became a weapon as subtle and terrifying as the blade, but far less detectable. In an age without forensic science, the most patient criminals often succeeded. Then there were the grave robbers. Mortality was omnipresent in the Middle Ages. Plague, famine, and war made death common. But that did not prevent fear or curiosity from growing around it. Some individuals exhumed corpses for profit, using bones, organs, or even entire bodies to sell to apothecaries, surgeons, or alchemists. Others dug up the recently deceased out of superstition, seeking supposed magical power in the remains. These acts were often punished harshly when court execution or public shaming, but their impact on folklore and local fear was enormous. People whispered that the dead never truly rested, that graveyards had spirits waiting to punish the living. Criminals of this type often blurred lines between superstition and practicality. Alchemists sometimes paid for stolen bodies to experiment upon. Unscrupulous apothecaries sought human fat for remedies. Meanwhile, bandits and thieves might rob graves to find gold buried with the deceased. The medieval imagination transformed these acts into haunting legends, so that centuries later, we still shiver at tales of skeletons rising from the earth or spectral apparitions in abandoned churches. Some of the most chilling examples of criminal ingenuity were women who operated within the household. Domestic poisoning, particularly among aristocratic families, became a feared art. Women had access to kitchens, potions, and knowledge of herbs, and in a world where courts and kings held rigid power over inheritance and marriage, taking life quietly often seemed like the only path to autonomy or revenge. While many were caught and executed, the tales of their crimes endured, reinforcing the idea that the most dangerous criminals were not always the most visible. And yet, even these dark acts were entwined with the social realities of the time. Plague, war, hunger, and hierarchy created conditions where morality was malleable. A man stealing bread might be considered a criminal, while a noble poisoning a rival could be lauded as cunning. The medieval world lived in a paradox. Justice was absolute, but its application was deeply unequal. By the late Middle Ages, these notorious criminals, killers, poisoners, grave robbers had a curious effect on society. They terrified the population, yes, but they also fascinated them. Stories of gruesome deeds traveled faster than messages from kings. Chroniclers recorded not just the facts of crime, but the details that ensured a shiver ran down the reader's spine. The method of murder, the cruelty of the act, the cleverness of escape, the eventual punishment. These stories became morality lessons, horror tales, and sometimes even entertainment. Consider the legend of the werewolf of Bedburg, Peter Stumpf, in Germany. He confessed under torture to murdering dozens of children while in the guise of a wolf, though whether the confession was true or a product of terror and coercion is debated. Regardless, his trial in 1589 became a cautionary tale, illustrating the combination of fear, rumor, and authority that could create a notorious criminal in the public imagination. Medieval serial killers and poisoners were the dark mirror of society. They revealed not just individual cruelty, but the anxieties and fears of an entire age. They showed how fragile life was, how easily rumor could become evidence, and how crime was a tool both of survival and of fascination. By the time the night descended over medieval villages, towns, and castles, these criminals had done more than steal, kill, or poison. They had embedded themselves into the cultural memory. The wind blowing across a deserted road might carry whispers of a bandit's steps. Shadows flickering against a castle wall could remind villagers of a murderer or heretic. Fear became entertainment, education, and warning all at once. And as you lie in bed, imagine the faint flicker of candlelight over a page chronicling these crimes. The medieval mind thrived on stories like these. They were part of the rhythm of daily life, work in the fields, prayers in the chapel, gossip by the fire, and then stories of the dark side of humanity. Everyone knew crime existed, everyone feared it, but in the telling, it became something almost safe, a tale to drift to sleep by, shivering just a little under your blanket. Some criminals of the Middle Ages are gone, their names whispered only in history books. Others live on in folklore, in ghost stories, in warnings told to children by firelight. But all of them share a lesson. The medieval world was dangerous, unpredictable, and fascinating, and crime was never just about punishment. It was about power, fear, survival, and imagination. And so, as the candle guttered and the wind swept through the empty streets, the shadow of the criminal lingered, not just in the cells, not just in the forest, not just in whispered rumors. It lingered in the mind, a reminder that humanity's fascination with darkness is timeless. By the late Middle Ages, crime had become more organized, more strategic, and occasionally, strangely theatrical. Not everyone was a lone killer or a desperate bandit. Some groups worked in networks, plotting raids, ambushes, and thefts with precision that could rival any modern gang. Take the highwaymen of England, for example. While the iconic Robin Hood may have been legendary, or possibly a composite of several outlaws, highwaymen were very real. They operated on the main roads connecting towns and cities, dressed in dark cloaks and hats, and often armed with swords, daggers, and bows. They relied on speed, secrecy, and reputation. One well-known tactic was to stop a coach at a blind bend or near a forest, brandishing a pistol or a sword, and demand everything of value: coins, jewelry, even horses. Failure to comply often meant death. Highwaymen were terrifying, yet they also carried a strange allure. Songs, ballads, and later pamphlets romanticized them as clever, daring, and sometimes noble thieves who were robbed from the rich. The truth was more mundane. They were desperate, violent, and occasionally betrayed by their own members. Still, the legend stuck. In inns across England, travelers would huddle by the fire and whisper, "They say Black Bart is on the road tonight," and shiver, imagining the flash of steel in the moonlight. Some criminal gangs were far more brutal and organized. The Bavarian robbers, for instance, controlled stretches of forest and river valleys in the 15th century. They didn't just rob travelers. They levied tolls on merchants moving through their territory, attacked convoys, and even threatened villages that resisted. Kings and local lords sent armed patrols to eliminate them, yet the forests provided perfect cover. For years, entire regions were under the quiet influence of these outlaw bands. Highwaymen weren't just about theft. They were performers in a sense, masters of intimidation and showmanship. Some used masks or makeup to appear terrifying. Others staged fake battles to make their numbers seem larger than they were. Psychological warfare was as important as the sword. A legend could do more work than 100 men. Then there were groups like the German Robinites, aristocrats who turned to crime when debts mounted or lands were lost. They held castles and fortresses, but instead of defending them, they became predators. Merchants traveling along rivers like the Rhine risked ambush and theft, sometimes torture, if they refused to pay ransom. Chroniclers called these nobles thieves in velvet, a phrase that captures the strangeness of medieval crime, where power and lawlessness could coexist in a single person. Not all organized criminals relied on violence. Some specialized in smuggling and forgery. Cities like Venice and Bruges were hubs for trade, and controlling the flow of goods meant controlling wealth. Smugglers could move salt, wine, spices, or coins across borders, evading taxes and enforcement. Forgers altered documents, counterfeit coins, and sometimes even rescued kidnapped heirs for ransom. Their crimes were invisible but deeply disruptive. Yet despite the danger, outlaw culture became entwined with imagination. Stories of bandits who hid in forests, helped the poor, or eluded capture for decades became bedtime tales, songs, and plays. People loved the clever thief who could outwit a sheriff, just as they feared the violent highwayman who could kill without hesitation. And then there were the folk heroes of regional legend figures whose names are less known today but were celebrated locally. In France, Cartouche became famous for robbing Parisian nobles and giving to the poor. In Germany, Schinderhannes led a gang that terrorized the Rhineland. Their escapades were chronicled in songs and stories, some romanticized, some terrifyingly accurate. These criminals blurred the line between outlaw and celebrity, hero and villain. Interestingly, medieval criminals also had networks of support. Villagers sometimes warned bandits about patrols, merchants discreetly paid protection money, and inns provided safe lodging in exchange for gold or secrecy. Crime was rarely isolated. It was part of a complex web of loyalty, fear, and survival. Even kings and nobles sometimes relied on criminals to serve political purposes. Highwaymen could be tolerated when it suited a lord, to disrupt trade or intimidate rivals. Some kings paid brigands to protect certain routes while ambushing others. Crime, in this sense, was woven into governance. The line between law enforcement and lawlessness was often thinner than a dagger's edge. Yet the appeal of these outlaws lies not just in their skill or audacity, but in their humanity. They ate, slept, loved, and feared like anyone else. Their legends survived, not because they were perfect, but because they embodied resistance, a flicker of rebellion against rigid hierarchies, against unfair taxation, against the world that made survival difficult. Highwaymen and criminal gangs remind us that medieval life wasn't simply about kings, castles, and wars. It was also about roads dark with danger, forests echoing with whispers, and villages where fear and admiration coexisted in the same breath. Life was precarious, and for some, crime was both necessity and identity. By candlelight, in the safety of home, medieval storytellers passed these tales along. Some warned of danger, some inspired daring, all kept the world's shadow close to consciousness. And that shadow of the thief, the bandit, the cunning outlaw, was an essential part of the medieval imagination. So, as the night stretches over villages and forests, as the wind rattles shutters and the faint hoot of an owl echoes through empty streets, imagine them, rogues riding fast horses, hiding in forests, whispering secrets in the dark. Some caught, some never seen again. Every theft, every ambush, every clever escape was recorded in whispers, songs, and the careful memory of the people. The medieval criminal was never just a villain. Sometimes he was a storyteller, a legend, a caution, or even a spark of hope for the powerless. And in that duality, the world felt alive, dangerous, thrilling, and terrifyingly real. And in that darkness, the stories of their deeds, clever, brutal, and unforgettable, became a lullaby of another sort. A reminder that even in a time ruled by fear, human cunning and audacity left its mark. And that is why, even now, the names of these criminals still echo through history, centuries later, in the shadows between fact and legend. As the medieval world trudged deeper into the shadows of fear and ignorance, another type of criminal began to take shape. The witch, the practitioner of forbidden knowledge, the one accused of bending nature and spirits to their will. Unlike thieves or murderers, these criminals were often invisible until suspicion fell upon them. They could be neighbors, healers, midwives, or even respected members of the community. Their crimes were rarely tangible. They existed in the imagination, in fear, in whispered rumors. Witchcraft in the Middle Ages was not merely superstition, it was an offense against both God and king. People believed witches could summon demons, curse crops, cause illness, or manipulate love and death. Anyone suspected of these abilities became a target of fear, accusation, and often brutal punishment. It's important to remember that many accused witches were ordinary women. Midwives, herbalists, or elderly women living alone often became scapegoats during famine, plague, or personal misfortune. If a child fell ill, if a cow died unexpectedly, if a storm ruined a harvest, the finger of blame could point toward the woman with knowledge of herbs, someone who seemed slightly outside the expected social norms. Once accused, the process was terrifying. Trials for witchcraft varied, but they often involved interrogation, forced confessions, and gruesome tests. One infamous test involved throwing the accused into water. If she floated, she was guilty, because water would reject evil. If she sank, she might drown, but at least be innocent. Either way, the accused faced nearly impossible odds. Then there were the inquisitions into magical crimes. Church authorities, often in partnership with secular rulers, prosecuted those accused of consorting with the devil. Records from Italy, Germany, and France detail confessions extracted under torture, naming accomplices, revealing secret pacts, and describing rituals that may or may not have ever occurred. Some accused witches confessed to meeting with demons at night, attending Sabbaths, or using spells to harm others. Modern historians suggest many confessions were coerced, imagined, or invented to appease inquisitors. In regions like Germany, France, and Switzerland, witch trials peaked in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. Hundreds could be accused within a single year. Villagers lived in constant fear, and denunciations were sometimes used as weapons in neighborly disputes. A simple quarrel could escalate into a charge of sorcery, sending the accused to the pyre or gallows. Witches were not only persecuted for harmful acts, they were accused for their knowledge. Herbal remedies, charms, or midwifery skills were often labeled as magical or dangerous. The very knowledge that could heal or protect was twisted into evidence of criminal intent. The same plants used to cure fever or calm a child could be seen as tools of the devil. Magic in the Middle Ages wasn't always sinister, of course. Many communities relied on charms, amulets, and blessings for protection. But when misfortune struck, the blame fell easily on those most visibly involved with the unseen world. This mixture of fear, superstition, and the desire for control created an environment where ordinary women, and sometimes men, were transformed into criminals overnight. One of the most infamous cases was Agnes Sampson in Scotland. Accused during the North Berwick witch trials in 1590, she was said to have raised storms to sink the king's ship and consorted with the devil. Under torture, she confessed to a vast network of witches, though modern historians suggest most of these confessions were imagined or forced. Agnes was executed, and her story became emblematic of the dark fear of magical crime in Europe. Witchcraft accusations were also tied to gender and social status. Women without husbands, widows, or those who lived outside the expected social roles were more likely to be targeted. Elderly women were particularly vulnerable, as age and isolation made them easy scapegoats. In essence, medieval society criminalized difference, curiosity, and independence when it clashed with rigid social norms. Magical crimes were often sensationalized in print as well. Pamphlets, sermons, and books spread terrifying stories of witches flying through the night, casting spells, or eating infants, exaggerations that fueled panic. These tales blurred the lines between truth and fiction, making the threat of magic seem both immediate and unstoppable. Yet even amid fear, some accused witches displayed remarkable courage. Some protested their innocence until death, challenging the authorities who sought confessions. Others cleverly navigated the system, bribing guards, pleading with neighbors, or relying on sympathetic clergy to save them. Their survival often depended on wit, luck, and the willingness of others to challenge superstition. Witchcraft trials remind us that medieval criminality was not always about material harm. Thought, belief, and knowledge could be enough to bring someone to the edge of death. This makes medieval crime fascinating. It wasn't only about stealing, killing, or robbery. It was about power, perception, and the terrifying authority of those who controlled fear. Magical crime also extended beyond accusations of witchcraft. Necromancers, alchemists, and astrologers could be prosecuted for manipulating knowledge or attempting forbidden arts. Alchemy promised wealth, transformation, or immortality. But if the church or local rulers believed it was tied to the devil, it became criminal. The pursuit of knowledge itself, in a world that feared deviation, could be fatal. Even simple charms or potions could land someone in prison. In England, France, and Italy, a woman selling a remedy for headaches or a charm for love might suddenly find herself accused of using magic to harm others. The very tools of survival became the tools of crime. And so, the medieval imagination created a vast spectrum of crime: thieves and murderers in the streets, poisoners in kitchens, outlaws in forests, and witches in homes. Each acted in a different realm, but all were bound together by fear. The fear of authority, the fear of the unknown, and the fear of being powerless. As night fell in villages and cities, as candles flickered in tiny homes, people whispered these stories to each other. Children clutched blankets as tales of witches, poisoned neighbors, and magical conspiracies unfolded. Fear was a companion to sleep, a constant shadow in the quiet moments. In many ways, the criminal of the mind, the witch, the magician, the heretic, was more terrifying than the highwayman or serial killer. You couldn't see them clearly. You didn't know when their crime would strike, and their punishment, when discovered, was often more elaborate, more horrifying, and more permanent than that of ordinary criminals. Yet, even amid fear, fascination endured. Witches were immortalized in story, in rumor, and later in plays and literature. They became symbols, not just of crime, but of human curiosity, defiance, and the complex intersection of power and knowledge. So as the medieval night stretched on, filled with wind-swept forests, flickering candlelight, and quiet whispers in the streets, remember this: crime was everywhere, but it was never only about theft or violence. Some of the most notorious acts were those committed in thought, in magic, and in defiance of fear itself. And those stories, whispered at night, were the ones that lingered in memory long after the executioner's sword had fallen. The highwaymen had vanished, and the poisoner's work was done. As the medieval night deepened, it's worth turning our attention to the places that held the culmination of crime: the prisons, dungeons, and execution sites, where justice, or what passed for justice, was delivered. These were not merely buildings or stone walls. They were theaters of human fear, control, and fascination, where criminals of every kind ended their stories, and where society confronted its own anxieties. Prisons in the Middle Ages were grim affairs. They were not designed for rehabilitation. They were holding cells, places to wait for trial, confession, or death. Dark, damp, and often overcrowded, medieval jails could house thieves, murderers, heretics, witches, and political prisoners side by side. Rats were constant companions. Food was meager, and hygiene nearly non-existent. One chronicler described a prison in 14th century France as a house of stone where hope goes to die. Yet, even in the darkness, medieval criminals had routines. Some scratched marks on walls, counting days or recording confessions. Others memorized prayers, muttered spells, or sang quietly to keep fear at bay. Even in despair, humanity persisted, and in some cases, prisoners could bribe guards, charm wardens, or secure brief freedoms. Life behind bars was never entirely hopeless. If you were clever, lucky, or well-connected, you might escape the worst. Execution was the final act, the ultimate spectacle of authority. Public hangings, beheadings, burnings, and tortures served both punishment and deterrence. Townsfolk gathered in squares to witness these events, their faces illuminated by torchlight or the early morning sun, eager to see justice enforced. The medieval mindset demanded that crime be visible and punishment memorable. The scaffold, often erected in the town square, was a stage. The condemned, whether thief, heretic, or witch, were brought forth in chains. Sometimes after weeks or months of imprisonment, priests might offer last rites. Families might beg for mercy. And then the executioner would step forward, steady, quiet, with instruments gleaming in the sun. There were variations depending on the crime and status of the criminal. Thieves might be hanged, sometimes left swinging in public for days. Murderers could face decapitation or quartering. Witches, particularly those accused of magical crimes, were often burned at the stake, the fire intended to purify the soul and terrify the community. Political prisoners or heretics could be drawn and quartered, beheaded, or exiled. The level of brutality was never consistent. It was a reflection of fear, power, and spectacle. The medieval executioner, as we have seen, occupied a strange place in society, both feared and necessary. Their work was methodical, almost ritualistic. It wasn't always about cruelty. It was about making death clear, fast, and publicly symbolic. A poorly delivered execution could provoke outrage. A well-executed punishment reminded the people of the law's reach and the consequences of disobedience. Even the instruments of punishment were charged with meaning. Chains symbolized captivity and shame. Stocks and pillories displayed the criminal for all to see, a warning written in flesh and humiliation. Branding irons marked thieves for life. Torture devices like the rack or Iron Maiden, horrifying as they were not always about extracting confession. Sometimes they were about reminding people that defiance had consequences. Yet, despite the terror, medieval punishment had layers of ritual, almost a dance between authority and society. The crowd's reaction, the condemned's behavior, and the executioner's precision all contributed to a narrative of justice, morality, and fear. The criminal was at the center, a living lesson for anyone who might consider stepping outside the law. And here is the paradox. While punishment was public and brutal, it immortalized the criminal in memory. Highwaymen, serial killers, poisoners, heretics, and witches became legends. People whispered their names for generations. Stories of clever escapes, shocking crimes, or defiant last words were recounted by firelight, ensuring that these criminals would never vanish entirely. Their lives and deaths shaped folklore, literature, and even modern imagination. Consider Jack of Newbury, a lesser-known English outlaw who became famous for audacious raids, yet was eventually captured and executed. Villagers whispered of his cunning, his narrow escapes, and the treasures he stole. Execution did not erase him. It cemented him in history. Similarly, witches like Agnes Sampson and poisoners like Julia Tofana continued to haunt collective memory. Their stories retold as warnings, entertainment, or fascination. The medieval world was obsessed with visibility. Crime, once committed, needed a response that everyone could witness. Punishment was not just for the criminal. It was a message to the living. It was theater and law combined, designed to remind communities of the fragility of order and the consequences of rebellion. Even as centuries passed, the echoes of these notorious criminals persisted. Roads haunted by highwaymen, forests rumored to shelter thieves, kitchens whispered to harbor poisoners, and dungeons remembered the cries of the imprisoned. All became threads woven into the tapestry of history. These stories remind us that crime is not merely an act, it is a reflection of society, its fears, its structures, and its fascination with the shadowed edges of human behavior. As you lie in bed tonight, consider the lives we've explored: the desperate thieves, the cunning poisoners, the solitary executioners, the rebellious heretics, and the misunderstood witches. Each acted within a world of scarcity, fear, superstition, and authority, where survival, defiance, and imagination intertwined. Their stories are dark, yes, but they are also profoundly human. History remembers them not simply because they broke laws, but because their lives illuminated the fragile balance between order and chaos. They reveal a world in which morality, justice, and power were intertwined with fear, superstition, and spectacle. And in telling their stories, we glimpse not just criminals, but the medieval world itself, raw, vivid, and unforgettable. So, as the candle guttering beside your pillow casts shadows across your room, and the wind whispers outside your window, remember, the world of the medieval criminal was complex, terrifying, and oddly compelling. Highwaymen raced through forests, executioners prepared their blades, witches whispered secrets, and heretics challenged the heavens, all within a world that demanded obedience, yet was perpetually on the edge of chaos. And in that quiet, between the shadows and the flickering firelight, you can almost hear their stories, echoing through time, a lullaby of darkness, curiosity, and human audacity. The past is never fully silent. It waits patiently in the shadows, in the forgotten roads, the ruined castles, and the whispered tales, ready to remind us that history's most notorious criminals were more than criminals. They were reflections of the world around them, and echoes of the fears and desires that have always lived in the human heart.